now my great pleasure to introduce our guests. Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao are the co-authors of the Friction Project: How Smart Leaders Make the Right Things Easier and the Wrong Things Harder. Bob is an organizational psychologist and professor of management science and engineering at the Stanford Engineering School, and Huggy is the Atul McBean Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Bob and Huggy, welcome.
Thank you.
And so let me just start by saying what a personal pleasure it is for me to moderate this session tonight. I've known Bob and Huggy for many years. They're Stanford legends, known both for their brilliance and for their off-the-charts sense of humor. Students really like funny professors, so they're popular. And businessmen and women have benefited from their insightful work over many years on workplace topics of great width and span. And so many people are looking forward to this new book. In all of Bob and Huggy's collaborations, they usually pick a topic we all deal with. And then through the depth of their research, their global exploration of examples, and their application of wisdom and humanity, they come up with new insights that really change your thinking about the problem. And that certainly happened for me as I read this book. And we will not have time to get all the pearls in the book onto the table tonight. So if you deal with this in your daily life, and we probably all do, you got to read this book. So let me start by asking Bob and Huggy to give us a high-level summary of what this
Oh,
is
gosh.
all about so that we can all get
Well,
on the same playing
well,
field.
well, to give you, I think the title sort of says it from our perspective. The best leaders, and by leaders we mean people at all different levels of an organization, everybody from CEOs to my favorite boss in the book, who is actually a manager at the Department of Motor Vehicles, believe it or not, who's my favorite manager, and that the best leaders see themselves as being aware of what should be difficult and what should be easy in organizations, and they engage in personal leadership behavior and also make a whole bunch of organizational design decisions to reach those goals. So our perspective is it's easy to say and hard to do. The best leaders make the right things easier and the wrong things harder. So that's the headline.
Good. And Huggy, what would you add to that?
I think Bob's given an excellent summary. I do mischievously want to interject that we originally thought of a different title for the book.
Yeah.
Instead of the Friction Project, we actually wanted to call it Fixers.
And did Stanford tell you that wasn't going to happen?
No. It was actually Stanford's fine if we swear. It's they are. We have academic freedom, but there's a whole bunch of problems with Amazon, and also we had a little web TV show at Stanford, and they weren't allowed to be in a show called Fixers, so that was another problem.
A simple idea behind the book is time poverty is the most invisible thing in organizations. People just have 24 hours to work, to lead a productive life. And virtually every employee in a modern organization suffers from time poverty. And that was really what led us into all of this. And I just want to give you, Mary, and the audience two quick sort of responses that are kind of two bookends that showcase the problem of time poverty. When we were teaching executives in one of the Stanford programs, we asked an executive, "Hey, where do you work?" And the guy looked at us with a glint in his eye and he says, "I work in a frustration factory." And you think, my God. And then there was another young woman, I can never forget her. She told us that I get exhausted after doing inconsequential work in my company. And when I go home, all I've got left are the scraps of myself for me and my family. And we just thought that was plain wrong. And that's why we went into this adventure into Friction. Won't you say, Bob?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's how it
Was there
started.
some particular precipitating event that was so horrible that you said we're going to start today?
No, I don't think we think that way. I think things go gradually, but I think since you were a member of the Stanford Board of Overseers, as I recall, Mary, I think it's worth mentioning our employer. So we have 70 years between us, something like that at Stanford. So there was and this is the first paragraph of the book, there was somebody who was kind of number 3 or number 4 at Stanford during if you'll remember the depths of the pandemic. when many of us were living too much time on Zoom. So this particular administrator sent us a 1,266 word email with a 7,500 word attachment. I'm not exaggerating. Um, because we had a fact check. In fact, a lawyer checked to make sure. He made us send the original email to him, and to spend a Saturday brainstorming about the new door school on Zoom. And I did write her boss and say, this could have been half the length at least. And if you do this was sent to 2,000 Stanford faculty members, and if you do the math, that's an example of somebody who isn't aware of what we call the cone of friction. We all have in fact, Ferry Claiborne is here, came up with the phrase, the cone of friction, so I'm
Right here.
stealing it from him, with the cone of friction idea. And she just wasn't thinking about the impact of her behavior on some 2,500 Stanford faculty members.
Yeah.
So there were many other events. Another thing that I would also add, and then I'm curious what Huggy says, is that the book that we wrote before in 2014 was Scaling Up Excellence. And there were all these large organizations, Google, Facebook, Salesforce, that their leaders wanted them to scale, baby, scale, and they did. And then they end up with a lot of red tape they have to untangle. So those were some of the things that got us going. That was the more rational part.
Well, one of the things that strikes you about the book is the breadth of your contacts. It's global, companies you're able to access. How did you get this done, and who helped you?
Ooh, what do you think, Huggy?
I think in many ways we are co-authors, but it's certainly on the title. But it was a large village of people who helped us. I mean, uh, um, you know, people in the behavior lab who allowed us to do experiments, PhD students who helped us with research, companies that gave access to uh, you know, to write cases, and executives who kind of challenged us. In fact, one of our favorite executives, Tuan, from Uber, former CTO of Uber, we asked him a simple question, hey, how do you know there's a lot of bad friction in your company? And this is an engineer, a very sophisticated engineer. He looks at us, smiles, and says, I just look at the sleep debt of my employees. If they're not all sleeping well, we have a lot of bad friction in the company. And it tells you how, as you were mentioning a little while ago, how insidious the problem of bad friction is in companies.
Yeah, so and I would just also, so we have the privilege of teaching really, really smart and motivated students.
Yes.
And so we taught a lot of classes in the friction. I ran a friction podcast through the Stanford Technology Ventures program for a year. And one person who actually may be here, there's an interesting person named Rebecca Hines, who actually started as our research assistant when she was an undergraduate in management science and engineering, which your daughter also has a couple degrees from too, Susie. And eventually she got a master's degree and she got a PhD, and now she runs the Work Innovation Lab at Asana. And somewhere towards the end of the book project, we did a project with her where it was a meeting reset, where we help people analyze and eliminate bad meetings and shorten them. So that's somebody who we've been working with on ideas in the book for at least 7 or 8 years. So there's some people who've helped at every stage. She's one of them.
Yeah. As you've looked at this for a while, what at the end of the day is the root cause of all this kludge in corporate America?
Ouch.
You want to? Well, we have 5 chapters. It must cover everything. Right?
Yeah.
On those, name a couple, Huggy.
I think for us, the biggest sort of suspect, if you will, is what we refer to as addition bias in the book, the human tendency to add rather than subtract. And, in one recent paper at Nature, which was a review of 20 other studies, it didn't matter what you asked people to do. Hey, build a Lego model, plan a trip, reform a university. About 90% of the suggestions had to do with adding more tasks, and about 10 or 11% had to do with subtracting them. So the addition bias is very, very pervasive. And when you combine time poverty with the addition bias, it's kind of like a double whammy. It's hard for employees to choose a more curious and generous version of themselves. How can you be curious when you're besieged by BS? And
Well put.
generous too.
Yeah. So I would add in addition, so this is like a psychological property, just as I guess those of us who survived the evolutionary forces were people who sort of hoarded stuff. So there's some reason that's what the people who study addition say. But also, if you look how organizations work, the people who will have a lot of people reporting to them, who start new initiatives, who add new software, maybe who hire new consulting firms, those are the people who tend to be rewarded, and the people who don't add stuff in the first place, or the people who actually subtract stuff. Because when you subtract stuff, you're almost always taking somebody's pet thing away from them. There's always somebody who wants that pet program, who wants that pet software, a bit of software, whatever. You're always going to end up hurting someone's feelings when you take things away from them. It's tragedy of the commons. So there's also organizational incentives that lead that to happen. But that's just one of the causes. One other cause I would say that I think is worth talking about is there's a bunch of research, and this is also cognitive, that when people think about let's take senior leaders, when they put together big organizations, they tend to think about assembling the best people and the best teams. Healthcare is especially bad at this, by the way, but they're not so good at thinking about how the pieces fit together. So we talk about a study done by one of my colleagues in my department, Melissa Valentine, on the cancer tax. So she did a bunch of research that showed that at a famous cancer center that had hired and built all the best departments in the world, but in the process, the senior executive didn't think about how the pieces fit together. So that was left to the patients and their families to navigate how all the pieces fit together. And that's not just a problem at this one cancer center. It's a problem with all of healthcare, which is sort of a story of fragmentation and friction, especially in the US system.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. I think we can all relate to that.
yeah.
And if I can add one more, and Bob and I have, talked a lot about this, and it's featured in the book too, and that is the obliviousness of senior executives.
Talk about that.
Well, they're like one body of research suggests, this is like over 15 years or so, that the more powerful an executive is and the more powerful an executive feels, the less likely they are to search. And so that means you're likely to have tunnel vision. So that's like one problem. The other big difficulty is one study shows that executives in the C-suites of companies, they may not know how work gets done 3 levels beneath them. So as a result, they underestimate coordination difficulty that Bob was just alluding to by as much as 50%. So you think everything is easy. So there's no check, there's no break, and you just are looking at your people always and saying, why didn't you get it done yesterday as opposed to today, And so all of that.
Well, let's get to what you found actually works to fix
Oh, thank goodness.
Yeah.
Time for some good news.
One thing that permeates it is your thought that everybody has responsibilities for becoming a friction fixer.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Could you just talk about what that means and what it looks like at the different levels in the company?
It seems to us that the first thing is leaders at every level. It doesn't matter whether you're leading a team, whether you're leading a department, a division, or a company. Our suggestion is we ought to act as trustees of other people's time. Because if you don't respect other people's time, you're essentially going to waste it and misallocate it. So start with that kind of recognition. That is like the first thing. The second mental change that we think executives need to undertake at any level is you can think of the team, you can think of the department, division, or company as the internal workings of the company as like a product. Is the organization structure easy to use? Are processes helpful? Do they get in the way? So if you think of the entire organization as a product, that opens up like a bunch of alternatives for you. And so we think that that's kind of where you need to begin. And perhaps the place we suggest that one ought to start with is first by removing obstacles that infuriate people. Do you want to talk about this, Bob?
Give us a good example.
Well, my favorite example in the book, and there's lots of examples, and I'm glad Mary's moving us towards optimism, because I won't talk for Huggy, but I started out thinking this problem was insoluble, and also that all friction was bad. And by the end of the project, I'm actually reasonably optimistic, and I'm not the most optimistic person in the world. And there's also times when friction is good. But if I was going to pick one that infuriated people and did damage, and it kind of goes back about 10 years ago. Perry Claiborne is here, and I keep calling on Perry. So we had this guy in our class. His name was Michael Brennan, and he took off 6 months to be at Stanford. His real job was being head of the United Way in southeastern Michigan. And the first time I met him, and you meet somebody the first time, he gets on his hands and his knees, and he rolls out this form he had in his pocket. What it was a 42-page benefits form with 1,000 questions that was completed by 2.5 million Michiganders a year to get benefits like health insurance, money, food, things like that. And he said, we've got to fix this. This is really terrible. And so it's easy to identify problems. So what Michael did is he actually hired 2 other Stanford folks from the Stanford Design School. He went back, started a nonprofit called Sevilla, and he did the hard work. Friction fixing is hard work, prototyping, working with users, working with state government, and to make a long story short, between 2016 and 2018, they came up with a new form, which is 80% shorter. It results in about 75% fewer mistakes, fewer lobby visits. So they actually improved a form that's filled out by 2.5 million Michiganders. And just on an editorial note, I really think that the government in San Francisco could really use somebody like Michael Brennan. But to me, that the arc of that story shows, and just in talking to Michael, he did all the hard work of getting every constituency involved in doing 6 or 7 different prototypes and helping them roll it out. His team, and that's a really good example. And yes, that was something that sucked, but he and his team actually did something about it.
Yeah. I think the thing that inspired both of us are examples of what we refer to in the book as mowing the lawn.
Yeah.
Because in companies, people actually eliminate things, but it's kind of like one and done. But you have to do subtraction and the removal of bad friction just as regularly as we mow the lawn. Because if you don't mow the lawn, the weeds are going to outrun it. And then you can't put any new saplings there. And one of the examples that Bob and I love is the story of AstraZeneca,
Well, tell me about
where, a team of 40 people. It's a regulated industry, as you full well know, pharmaceuticals. And a team of 40 people saved the company 2 million hours. And they gave back 2 million hours so the company could serve 4 million more patients and run 400 early phase trials. And the thing that really, we were interviewing the woman who led this initiative, Pushkala Subramaniam, and we were asking her, was this like an elite managerial endeavor, or was it pervasive throughout the organization? And she gave an example that was, to me and Bob too, very striking. And so she said, people go to work at Astra, work starts at 8 o'clock, everybody shows up at 7:45, you got to swipe your card, there's a bar that goes up and down. And invariably, there was a traffic jam. So people actually started working at half an hour later because of this traffic jam that was created. So after she organizes a World Simplification Day, she turns up at Astra and she realizes there's like no check-in required, nothing. And she asks the security guard, who's a contractual employee, hey, what happened to all of that paraphernalia? And he looks at her and says, Madam, you had the World Simplification Day. You want to give everybody the gift of time? I thought I could give all of you half an hour each day. I mean, just think of a security guard, which was like astonishing.
That talks about the responsibility up and down.
Yeah, the response. So I mean, one other thing I think is worth talking about is so back to some of these coordination and collaboration issues. One of the reasons that there's friction in organizations and this is a little bit more subtle on the coordination front, is that people don't coordinate in part in some organizations because they see other people as enemies. And so you kind of, if you're going to fix the handoffs and get people to collaborate, you kind of got to start with, well, who's the star? Is it somebody who helps people succeed, or is it somebody who squishes them? And at least the best turnaround I've seen in a large corporation in recent years is what Satya Nadella has done at Microsoft. And he's done a really smart engineer can tell you about all the engineering changes they've done, and they've been very early in OpenAI and doing a good job with that. But one of the first things that Satya did when he took over as CEO in 2014 is that he and the folks at HR got rid of their definition as a superstar under Steve Ballmer to name somebody. Steve Ballmer was smart and hung on to all of his stock, which he drove the company to the ground, and Satya made a couple $2 billion for Ballmer. But anyways, so there used to be under Steve Ballmer, the superstar was somebody who got ahead by crushing other people. And Satya and Nadella, they have talking about mowing the lawn. In your regular performance evaluation, the question isn't just, are you and your team doing great work, but are you creating a condition where other people can succeed that you're connected to? And I think that the definition of a superstar, to me, is a really important measure of whether or not cooperation and coordination is happening in an organization where everybody's got the knives out.
Yeah. Actually, could you just expand that a little bit, just talking about the qualities that good friction fixers in general have?
What do you think, Huggy?
If I were to summarize it shortly, for me, what good friction fixers do is they multiply curiosity with generosity. They are constantly kind of trying to understand, ask questions. Why is this happening? Why is that happening? And so you notice all these weak signals, and you can quickly put them together and identify the problem. And they're generous because what they have is they have a big help muscle, not merely an ask muscle. And I think those two characteristics, in a sense, are necessary for friction fixers. Won't you say that, Bob?
Yeah, I like that. I also, and just knowing a little bit about your leadership style, this definitely applies to you, Mary. Another thing, and this is not just friction fixers, but all leaders. I think leaders who are good, they're kind of restless. So this is mowing the lawn. Brad Bird, we interviewed him a long time ago, the Academy Award-winning director from Pixar, and he talked about relentless restlessness.
Yes.
That people who are good at this, it's never, okay, we're doing all right, we're getting better, but it's never, the work is never actually done. So I think that's another thing that it's kind of exhausting working in places like that, but those are the best leaders and the best workplaces too.
Bob, one thing you said was there's good friction and bad friction. We haven't really defined that. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. What's the good friction? What's the bad friction?
Well, I'm not I was a psychology major, so be careful when I define a word like friction. We'll get like a real physicist here. But to us, organizational friction is when somebody tries to accomplish something and it's slower and maybe more frustrating than they want it to be. And sometimes that's good. And sometimes it's bad, and and there's some things that should be impossible to do, and some things that should be easy. I'll give a great example. So doing things that are unlawful or rushing things into the marketplace that aren't ready is probably not a good idea. We use the example of Google Glass, and in fact, I got interviewed by a member of the Google Glass team recently. She was kind of giving me grief. Emily Ma, we got interviewed by her last week. But I like the example of Elizabeth Holmes, because Elizabeth Holmes is somebody who was very impatient, and to me, my favorite story in the sort of Elizabeth Holmes saga, in some ways, was she really pressed the U.S. Army to put her blood testing device, which did not get FDA approval, on U.S. Army helicopters. And even though she had Mad Dog Mattis on her side, some sort of petty bureaucrat stopped her because it didn't have FDA approval. And in contrast, I would point to a startup which we do talk about in the book. It's called Sequel. It was started by two Stanford grads who graduated, by the way, Greta Meyer and Amanda Calabrese. And they took every entrepreneurship class. And what Sequel is doing is reinventing the modern tampon. They worked on the physics of the thing, and they just got FDA approval in August. So they didn't drop out, and they got FDA approval. And I think that those are two women who sort of slowed down, and I hope they win in the marketplace. But they slowed down so they can hit the gas later. Yeah. And to me, there's some things that should be difficult and slow, including friction fixing.
If I can just extend and jet ski behind Bob's remarks, friction for us is obstacles. We think of bad friction as obstacles that infuriate, enrage, and overwhelm people. So that's the bad friction part. Good friction consists of obstacles that, as Bob was mentioning, slow down people, but also educate them and hopefully foster more deliberation. So our job is sort of twofold. We've got to insert good friction. We've got to take out bad friction. A quick example of good friction is, years ago we had Ben Horowitz come to our class.
Andreessen Horowitz.
Yeah, Andreessen
Venture
Horowitz.
capital firm.
Yeah, and he was describing how their investment committee functions. There are 5 people. If all 5 of them agree, they're unlikely to invest in the venture. Because they say if all of us agree, it means somebody else is doing something that we don't know or already has done it. They actually want disagreement because that's an indication of due diligence, And the other thing is they feel that innovative ideas are by definition controversial, and that ought to be reflected in the voting pattern.
That's actually the power of diversity, Jim.
The power of that is. So I would also, one of my favorite, almost, if you said what's one example that almost defines the spirit of the book, is we're interested in situations where good friction gets rid of bad friction.
Yes.
And a really simple example, I think you're having him as a guest in your class soon.
Yes.
So some of us may remember Laszlo Bock was head of people operations, which is essentially head of HR at Google for about 8 or 10 years. And when he got to Google, there was a tradition, which was actually a great idea in the early days, which and Larry and Sergey started this, that because they wanted to scale the company with the really great people who fit really well. They do 8, 12, 15. And when I first put this in the Wall Street Journal, Laszlo fact-checked me. I said, is it 8, 12, 15? He said, well, once it was 25 job interviews before deciding whether or not to give somebody an offer. So, I mean, and you just do the math about how much friction that is, how many you have to schedule, how many candidates that you piss off when we're going to Facebook in those days. And so he came up with a simple rule, and the simple rule was, if you are going to do more than 4 job interviews, you have to get written permission from me. So people say authority is bad, rules are bad. Well, I think in this case, authority and rules were actually good.
Absolutely.
But the reason I like that example is it's using good friction to get rid of bad friction that's systemic.
Another example that really struck me in the book of the use of slowing down was the Roman Haas executive who realized he needed to do going fast for many things was good, but there were certain things that you needed to go slow. Could you talk about that?
Well, I mean, so that's when it comes to important strategic decisions, and I mean, one of the distinctions there, and maybe you can extend on this a little bit, is, Jeff Bezos. He's kind of annoys me sometimes, but he's done some pretty good stuff, and he talks about the difference between one-way and two-way doors, and if you're going to make a decision that's reversible, then that's a situation where, if it's reversible, if it's cheap, it's not going to threaten the company, it's not going to kill anybody, then you can just do a prototype and experiment. But so if it's a two-way door, but if it's something that's not reversible, like selling your company, doing a huge merger, firing the CEO, as we found out with Sam Altman, I thought that was absolutely one of the most interesting decisions I've ever saw, because the board thought that it was a one-way door for Sam Altman, but it actually turned out to be a two-way door for him and a one-way door for them. So I thought that was one of the more interesting decisions that I've seen. But I think this notion of it kind of depends on the nature of the decision that you're talking about, and in that case, they were talking about strategic decisions. Yeah. You want to hop on this?
Yeah, I mean, about the slowing down, since you're, of course, a legal luminary, I thought you might find this study interesting, Mary. We'd asked one of our graduate students, hey, take a look at all the Bay Area startups, use a large language model. Tell us, after looking at all their public filings and vision and mission and whatever, how much do they linguistically emphasize speed? So she came up with a number, and I said, great. Now that we know the number, why don't you tell us how does that affect or predict the speed at which you receive a unicorn valuation? And what did she find? The more you emphasize speed, the shorter the time taken to be a unicorn. You're getting a $1 billion valuation. So she was overjoyed. And we said, wait a minute, do one more analysis. Show us the relationship between the time taken to be a unicorn and the probability of being barraged by lawsuits 2 years down the line. And what do you find? The faster you became a unicorn, the more likely you're going to be the target of lawsuits and the like.
But then you can afford all those expensive lawyers too, right?
Lawyers love this.
I thought so.
So you talked a little bit about the obliviousness of leaders and how that can impact an organization. Wherever you are in the organization, many people are leading someone. So could you just talk a little bit more about the bad obliviousness? And it sounded to me from reading the book that a lot of it is kind of self-awareness of the human being. And maybe you can tell us
So
what you've seen.
it's especially a problem for people in power because there's this, there's a lovely definition of privilege is that when you're, have a lot of power, one of the things that comes with it is the absence of inconvenience that the little people have to suffer from. And so one of the reasons, in addition to the fact that just having power is not good for one's mind, you've got to be careful of it, is that when people get in powerful positions, there's all sorts of hassles they don't have to go through. And my favorite example is what happened to me when I had a problem with Comcast. My mother had passed away, and I had all this complication with getting just her service sort of disconnected, but not completely. And it was a classic thing. I went through. They have the worst phone tree ever. If you ever try their phone tree, bless you. So I went through the phone tree, and they'd make mistakes. They had problems. Anyway, so I did the crass thing of complaining on Twitter. And I know a board member, and a board member wrote me, and he was very concerned I was upset and complaining about his company. So I got what I call the white privilege or VIP line. So they just sent me this phone number. I called, and on 2 rings, some group in Arizona answered, and everything was fixed immediately. And also, I didn't even have to pay any fees that the little people had to pay. And somebody came to my house for no charge and all this sort of stuff. And so to me, my first reaction was, oh, this feels really good. I don't have to suffer the little people. But my other reaction was, so I suspect all the senior executives have this, and they don't have to go through the darn phone tree that I have to go. So that's one of the reasons that those problems don't get fixed, is because literally when people in senior executive positions are protected from the inconveniences that the rest of the people, including their customers and regular employees, have, that's something that makes me nervous.
Yeah. How many little people do we have?
Yeah. Well, we're all little people. That's right. So.
That's a great story. So, are there cultural differences around the globe that make this different, or is it pretty much the same in Europe, Asia, and the United States?
Ooh. What do you think, Huggy?
I would say this problem of friction is really pervasive throughout the world. It manifests itself in different ways. And you can see these problems of friction, they actually come to life when there are cross-border mergers. Company in country A buys a company in country B, and you can actually see all of the difficulties. One of the funniest stories we ever heard about this friction was Walmart going to Germany, where what they did was they actually trained the German staff in the ethic of customer service that normally everybody in America is trained in. So when they did this, a lot of the women employees also went through training, but apparently when they smiled and welcomed people and so on and so forth in a Walmart store, male Germans coded this as a very different kind of signal, which led to comic encounters, as you can imagine, in the Walmart store. So this is like a simple thing of like being completely oblivious as to, what happens there. Or another company, Carrefour, going from France to Japan. And so Japanese customers go there thinking they're going to find things that in Carrefour that you get in France, only to find that you get the same things you get in any Japanese store. Why would you go to Carrefour? So these are all examples of, if you will, people unwittingly creating friction and stumbling over things.
Yeah.
Well, that's so. I I'm not sure anybody's asked us this yet. So one thing this does occur to me. So we talk in the book about the notion that labor leads to love, and
Yes.
this is called the IKEA effect. So academics will do the stuff where they'll either say how much would you pay for this box, and whether or not you assemble it has a big effect. This is why I call it the IKEA effect. People will pay more money for a box that they've assembled, and when IKEA moved to China, it was an interesting effect because in the United States and other countries where it's more sort of do-it-yourself culture, they ended up making some changes, including having more assembly and more delivery services than the United States to deal with the cultural differences. So for a couple of years, since this is in our last book on scaling up excellence, I would talk to audiences about the IKEA differences in China versus the United States until I spoke to a group of 50 Chinese executives, so say they're all with simultaneous translation and all that kind of stuff. And so this guy raises his hand, and this is through the translator, and he says, I don't assemble anything, but I do assemble IKEA stuff, and they've trained us. So it's a case where the culture of the do-it-yourself culture from IKEA has actually moved, at least according to this group in China. And I knew they'd actually done it because one of the guys said in English, "Not good for your relationship with your spouse." He'd really done it. So
That's amazing.
but I thought that was a pretty interesting example of a cross-cultural effect that they did try to make some adjustments, but then they also educated too.
That's really interesting. Could you talk a little bit more about this labor creating love and how?
Well, so this is every fraternity, every sorority, every cult. They all know this. Every Army boot camp is that there's all sorts of evidence by academics that the more you work towards something, the more you suffer, the more you will value it independently of its objective value. And this idea about effort justification is sort of I work so hard, this must be really important. So that's one of the reasons that people don't quit things they should quit. And it's also, and there's also another angle to this. So that's the psychological commitment part of it. There's also a bunch of evidence, and this is another argument for good friction that isn't just sort of like the more time you waste, the more important you think it is. There's a whole bunch of studies that show that the more people have worked together, Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett would be sort of exhibit A. The more people have worked together, the more effective that they are. So, I mean, just even for example, there's some interesting evidence that when people have done group projects together as students, they're more likely to have successful startups. And that goes back to Hewlett and Packard and Larry and Sergey and on, Instagram guys. So this idea that, you can't hurry love, labor learns to love, it also is a mutual understanding and trust thing.
Yeah, definitely. I've gotten a couple of really interesting questions from the audience. This one intrigues me. Can you address institutional friction as it applies to the Congress? And
you can have that one, Huggy.
Oh, my.
If not, I'm going to do a cold call in the audience. Come on, Huggy. Who are you going to insult?
I really have to restrain myself.
Thank
here.
you.
And I have to really summon my rational self. Otherwise, I'll just fall apart. I don't want to do that. That is actually a really good question. But when we really look at Congress, it seems to me that what Congress is very good at doing is allocating gains. You want an air base in Nevada? Great. You want one in Mississippi? Great. There's no resource constraint. But what Congress is terrible at is allocating losses. Who's going to close down their air base, And that's where they kind of get immobilized. And the problem, of course, these days in Congress is, in addition to this inability to allocate losses, is actually the existence of prejudice. And once you have prejudice where the other person is the enemy, as Bob mentioned, and they have a symmetrical reaction to you, it's kind of very hard to sort of get anything done. And it's disappointing, it's frustrating. And you can see all of this happening in the way, we managed to, we haven't passed a budget yet, and they do all these stopgap measures to kind of make sure that the government is kind of functioning. So it's it's a place where one ought to really carefully think of what is it we need to include there so that they can make better decisions allocating losses.
We need to look at friction fixing capabilities.
Boy, Huggy, that was such a rational answer. Congratulations.
Thank you so very much. I have to tell you, otherwise, the person kind of looming large in my mind was James Comer of Kentucky, and I didn't want to pursue.
Okay, that's good. Thank you.
So, between the two of you, have you had friction between the two of you, and how do you deal with it?
Oh. Well, yeah, of course. I can't believe we're being asked this question, but
The audience wants to know.
So Mary knows me very well, and she knows my wife very well, and in my relationship with my wife Marina, I don't need to be the adult in the relationship, and with Huggy,
That's true.
yeah, since you worked with Marina for years, but with Huggy, I have to be the adult in the relationship. And this is one of the only relationships I've had as an adult where except like with students and stuff, but really
Marina and I are in awe.
that I have to be the adult. So like I nag him. I think I've yelled at you twice in the course of the project, which isn't really that much given how given how I am and how anyways. But so that's I think the source of the friction is that I have to be the adult in the relationship. And one thing I will say to Huggy's credit is it never seems to bother him when I nag him, which I don't really understand. It would drive, if he nagged me as much as I nag him, it would drive me nuts. So I don't know whether that's an accurate description, but I just can't believe I have to be the adult in this relationship.
Huggy, your defense?
Well, the thing is, Bob clearly is the more gifted writer of the both of us. No, he really is, he's an extraordinary writer, and he's also very exacting. So there have been occasions where we've spent 3 hours debating 4 words in which order they ought to go in. And I'm like, do we really need to do this? And no, he's very insistent. And he's actually right, more often than...
That's good friction?
Exactly.
Well, the other thing that poor Huggy had is that, so one thing that's very important, and we even have this notion that the best friction fixers, we could have said this, are editors. They think like editors in chief, which is what should be hard, what should be easy, how can we move things around? And so we had this editor. This guy's name is Tim Bartlett.
Yes.
He is such a good editor. And the other thing I love about Tim, and Huggy thought we were nuts, Tim and I can spend 2 hours working on 2 sentences and be so happy. And Huggy just thinks we're just okay. If you boys want to do that, that's fine. But so that's
It's like
that was
30
another
emails being.
and the thing about Tim is he doesn't even get he gets exhausted. It takes him longer than me. So I just love working with him. And so the book he's probably most famous for that you've all heard of is A Radical Candor. So he's worked with Kim Scott, and there's a crazy book by Safi Bahcall that's called Loon Shots. Is another book he edited, but Tim mostly has not done management books. He's done history, he's done politics. He accidentally sort of fell into management books when he did Radical Candor with Kim Scott, but he's such a good editor. I just love him.
Clearly takes a team.
It does. It does. It takes a village. It's true. There's 2 authors on the title, but it takes a lot of people.
I got a question from the audience about from someone who says there's a lot of fear-based decision-making in my organization. And what if I make a mistake? What does this change mean for me, et cetera? How can middle managers help this fear base in the middle of the organization to get rid of some of the friction?
You got an answer?
Well, I'll try.
Okay.
Well, the way I sort of would like to kind of respond to that question, Mary, is that the metaphor that crosses my mind is people are actually in a room called fear. And what we need to do is we need to take them to a room called confidence. And so you can't just walk out of the room called fear and immediately go to the room called confidence. You actually need like a psychological passageway or a corridor. And what effective leaders do is they figure out what that psychological passageway is, what actually that corridor is. And so you can actually reduce a lot of fear because quite a bit of the fear may be imagined. And a lot also depends on how you frame the problem. You can frame the problem in an accusatory way and say somebody is to blame for it, or you can frame the problem as, hey, this is actually what the customer is saying. And it seems to me that the lower down in the organization you are, my hypothesis would be that your best ally would be the customer to help you cross the corridor and get to the room called confidence, and hopefully you can carry other people too. Now, one of the simplest ways in which you can reduce fear is, even for leaders of teams and so forth, is to have what's called an upside down town hall meeting, where instead of the boss kind of yammering, you actually rely on questions from the audience, and the questions can be anonymously sourced. You don't need to identify an individual. But what's most crucial is, once you've identified a question, you've got to take action and show that you take them seriously. Otherwise, the supply of questions is going to dwindle.
So I like that answer. I would also add, and this does vary from organization to organization, but we tend to just say an organization, I don't know, like Microsoft, Walmart, sort of pick whatever, Stanford University, pick whatever you want. We tend to think of it as, from the outside especially, as being sort of a unified whole. But Gallup, and they've had data like this for years, that shows that actually the overall culture of the organization, so let's take psychological safety or fear, is actually not a very strong predictor of whether or not you feel psychologically safe, or you're in the room called fear. As Huggy would say, what really matters the most is the next person up the hierarchy, the boss. And they've got all sorts of studies that show that for example, the overall quality of engagement in an organization, it varies so much. It doesn't matter what organization you're in. It matters more what your boss is. So the recommendation that comes out of that is that developing high quality, especially first line leaders in organization, is what really matters. So anybody who's got anybody reporting to them can really have a big effect on whether people feel fear or not. If you look, and Gallup's they got 50 years of data on this.
And if you're reporting to a jerk, vote with your feet.
Wow, if you're reporting to a jerk, it's exit voice or loyalty. You quit, you shut up because you can't find another job, or you just put up with it, or you go to war against them. You kind of got to decide which of the three.
Yeah. Do you have good examples where bureaucracy, the friction was moved in a positive direction by people from the middle taking it on?
The AstraZeneca example is one, but let me give you another example, Mary. We're trying to write the case study on the DMV, Bob.
Yeah, we're in early conversations with the California Department of Motor Vehicles leadership.
And a lot of what they're doing hinges really on middle management and lower management. Wouldn't you say that?
Yeah.
Because Steve Gordon, the outsider who actually came in, wanted to change the organization. And effectively, the way we see it is, this is an ossified bureaucracy where one would, most people say DMV, we think of the words awful and this and that. It's everybody's private version of hell. If that's what we think, can you imagine the employees at the DMV? How hard? I mean, who would give a card saying, hey, I work for the California DMV? I mean, most people wouldn't, I would submit. But what this leader is doing is really refounding the organization and instilling pride in middle managers to go and do things. You should tell them about the lovely example of going
You
for
mentioned
your
that at the
mom.
beginning. Give us your example.
So my example of the DMV, and by the way, we just started talking to this guy Steve Gordon and his team about 3 or 4 weeks ago. And we may actually do a case, and they're doing a lot of technological solutions too. But my experience was, I went to the DMV and I thought I got there at 7:30 in the morning and basically allocated my whole morning. And this is in Redwood City. And this amazing person, and there were 60 people in line in front of me. And this amazing person walked out at 7:40, and he walked down the line and asked each of us why we were there. And some of us he gave forms. One person was there to get a passport, which you can't do at the DMV. So that person was sent home. And he gave me my form to fill out, and he told me what window to go to first. and I was out of there by 8:20, and I couldn't believe that one of the best experiences that I had was the 45 minutes I spent at the California DMV. And in part it was because you had somebody doing triage to help us through the system. And Steve said that's the kind of both culture and process they're trying to instill in their branches. And they're not perfect. They make mistakes, but then so does every bureaucracy. And then one thing that he did talk about is the real ID, which almost all of us are going to have to do. They keep pushing back the deadline, and that's something that they have to get a wet signature. So you do have to go to the DMV, and unless they're trying to change that law too, but they've changed that so that it used to take 28 minutes at the DMV, and now it takes an average of 8 minutes. So that to me is a sign that's friction fixing.
Absolutely.
And so that would be an example. And we're trying to learn more about them, but from what we're learning, I'm impressed by what they're trying to do and what they're doing.
Did you actually ask the guy that was helping you why he was doing it? Did
Oh
you
no, he was too
interview him?
busy. We asked Steve Gordon though, and he said that's one of the things we're trying to do. And he did say essentially this is one of the solutions that we talk about in the book that's in between organizational design and just trying to make people feel better. Sometimes in complex bureaucracies, sometimes there's people who kind of act as tour guides, and those are the people who tell you what steps to take. And the other thing they tell you to do, and we have some people at Stanford who are wonderful at this, is they tell you which people to avoid and which people to ask for help. Because we all know that there's some people, if you go to them and you ask and you give them a problem, they make it complicated. They try to make you suffer as much as possible. And there's other people who actually want to help you. And to me, that's sort of like another element of friction fixing, which is in between changing the organizational design and just giving people therapy about the situation that they're in.
What's the state of play on, let's say you're the boss of a fairly large organization. How do you identify the people who smooth things along and those that are part of the sludge? Is there a way to actually see that clearly?
But Stanford, we just asked the students.
Yeah.
I'm serious. In our department, we ask people like, who makes your life miserable and who helps you? I mean, the classic person, and I bet many of you have in your organization, is the person who approves expenses. And I've never understood this. There are some people who approve expenses who they want to say yes, they don't want you to break the rules. And there's other people who just want to make you suffer. So I think gossip is another thing, because we all know who those people are. You just stay away from them.
Yeah.
And maybe they're not very busy. Maybe that's why when you go to see them, they make you suffer so much.
True enough.
One question I got here is interesting. Is there a CEO or executive that you would like to interview to gain more insight? Because you're kind of watching them from the outside.
What do you think?
I think there are a number of CEOs, at least I'd love to learn more from. And when I think of this range of CEOs, and we've already talked to him, Shantanu from Adobe,
Shantanu Narayan from Adobe is interesting.
Because they've actually undertaken a bunch of changes. Another person to actually talk to is the CEO of Walmart. You're going there to give a talk at Walmart. And one of the interesting things companies like Walmart, if not Walmart, are trying to do is they're actually using AI to identify sources of friction and make life better for people. I can't name the company because we haven't nailed down the case study idea yet. But in this company, they're actually in the networking space. And what do? They actually used AI to comb through 1.2 billion log files, which no human being can wade through. And I was asking them, what's the result of your AI effort? And the guy looks at me and he says, the best outcome is our network engineers, they're not woken up at night. They can sleep throughout the night. They don't have sleep debt. But another person I'd really like to learn from would be this young woman called Malala. She's a remarkable person. Think of all the things she's doing the world over.
Yeah.
I would really like to learn a lot from her. Another person I would love to interview about creating good friction would be Greta Thunberg.
Yeah.
So when I think of when you said CEOs, I'm kind of more thinking of founder activist as a category, Mary.
Yeah.
So,
young people.
Young people, I think that's so. Satya Nadella I already mentioned him. The person I did interview him a couple of times. The most interesting person, at least I thought that I interviewed in terms of like just oh, this is really exciting. There's a guy named Todd Park. Todd Park is most famous for when he was a CTO in the Obama administration for leading the process that fixed the Obamacare website. Some of you may remember it was so broken you'd click and there'd be 8-second delay if it didn't crash. And he brought together the nerds from Silicon Valley and the longtime contractors to actually fix it. So he's famous for that, and he's going to be a guest in your class in a couple of weeks. I'm going to miss it. So when we interviewed him, so I talked to a lot of executives. So this is a guy, he's a kind of a famous software guy. He started Athena Health with his brother and everything. So the first 5 minutes he talked about love. And I'm not used to CEOs talk about love. And so he and his brother, Ed, have started a company. It's in, I think, 17 states. You'll find it Devoted Health. And what Devoted Health is, for people like me over 65, it's to kind of give you one point of interaction with the fragmented healthcare system. And so he said, he's really good at logistics. He understands software really well. But he said, our philosophy is that we train and socialize and reward people so that that point of contact, that one point of contact you have with Devoted Health, is you should treat the patient or the customer just like your mother or father. You should treat them like somebody you love. And what kind of experience would somebody you love want to have? And if he was here, he just sort of vibrates with this kind of positive energy. And so that was one of the most, I think that was the most, and it was very late in the process. And he was one of the most exciting CEOs that I met. And if he can reduce friction for those of us dealing with the American healthcare system, he really will have done something.
That's true. That is a huge problem.
Yeah, I just can't believe how difficult it is to deal with it.
That's cool. Good question here. Any tips for dealing with intergenerational friction, as in the older or the younger workforce?
Ooh.
So, one example that quickly flashed through my mind as soon as I heard the question is this idea of reverse mentoring in companies. I actually was at an Indian company, and he's a Stanford alum. And he said, Huggy, I want you to meet my mentor. And he's the CEO of the company. He was actually a young engineer. Excuse me. And he was saying, I found I was asking my son, who was too busy. I have young engineers, they can educate me. One simple way in which we could get that jump started.
That's cool. That's a very good thought.
Excuse me.
So, I mean, one of the things that we do, it's interesting. I think of some of the stuff that works in class with Stanford students is that we actually say things to them. Well, if you were president of Stanford for a week, what would you do? We also have them talk about stupid stuff at Stanford. So I think that's some of the stuff that you can do. But the intergenerational stuff is actually often tough. But just one thing about it, I think that is worth saying, is there's all of this stuff that always comes out that whatever the new generation is, it's like XYZ, sort of pick one, that there's never been like one quite like them that is lazy or parties or pick whatever derogatory thing you want to say. But at least my friends who are real demographers and have been studying this for a long time, they will tell you that there has always been tension between old people and young people because they have different demands on them. And this is not new. It happened with baby boomers. It's happened with every generation. So there isn't anything necessarily distinct about the new generation of youngins who just don't get it. And at least my generation, you talk about people like party and being irresponsible, like we were the worst from what I can tell. So we were not better. So a lot of the intergenerational stuff is just structural. It's the difference between how younger people and older people sort of process things.
That's certainly true, Bob. But as I listened to you, one of the areas I was thinking was where there is actually a difference is employee activism. Younger people are way more activist. I mean, companies can't sell these products. You can't do this, you can't do that. And a lot of CEOs and leaders, they're kind of completely unprepared for such employee activism on the part of young people. And the other thing with young people is they don't actually think conversations in the company are confined to the company. They tweet about it, they write about it on LinkedIn. So So the entire firm is really like a conversation. So all of that is certainly harder for senior executives who belong.
Well,
I
some
think, to
firms,
older generation.
Apple still just fires people. I mean, Apple's got better security than the CIA, which I think kind of helps them. I'm not supposed to say it either.
I love that line.
I don't know anybody at Apple who tweets wildly, or you just don't.
Yeah, they'd be
They work there for 10 minutes and then they're gone.
true enough.
So, in doing this research for your book, what was the thing that most surprised or shocked you?
Ooh.
One of
No,
the-
it must be a hard question. So what? So the thing that if I would pick one, well, I would pick two things. One is that I actually got more optimistic throughout, and then the other thing that surprised me is that I sort of started out with this view that everything that's difficult and slow, it's just somebody who is stupid and getting in the way. And one thing that I did get interested in surprised me was that something should be slow. And it was a surprise, but it's something that even since the book came out, I've gotten more and more into this notion. There's a really cool academic research on savoring. So there's coping. So bad things happen in your life, and you try to minimize how much they upset you. Sort of do the cognitive behavioral therapy thing. But there's a sort of a counterpoint research, which is savoring, which is the good things in life. They should be slow. They should be enjoyable. You should sort of linger over them. So it's sort of like rushing through like a 3-star Michelin meal would be bad. And my favorite example, and we just had this fact check, so this is brand new, and it's in the book, is that the largest grocery store chain in the Netherlands and Holland, it's called Jumbo, and they experimented with slow lanes, and like slow lanes to go to a grocery store. I just want to get in and out, and so they have some efforts in Holland to help lonely people, especially lonely older people. So these are chat lanes where you get in to have a nice little conversation with the clerk. And this was fact checked 2 weeks ago, and it's now spread by the end of 2023 to about 200 Jumbo grocery stores. And that, honestly, the concept of going to a grocery store for a slow lane, I just couldn't believe it. But then when you think about savoring, it sort of makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. Huggy?
Yeah. For me, the biggest surprise actually was about myself. I mean, you write a book and you learn things about yourself that kind of startled me. My wiser half is actually here in the audience, and I'm sure she might correct me later. But, I always thought of my job as of a professor as I mentioned earlier, also pertaining to curiosity and generosity. But as I was writing the book, I kind of realized that one of the things I was doing and I was blind to was I was parking curiosity at work. And I just wasn't being curious enough at home. And I think that's fortunately my wiser half is better than me in helping me make this transition. So now, cooking becomes an adventure, less of a chore. And, one of the things we've kind of done, and this is something I'd recommend to everybody, is get an old-fashioned atlas, spread it out, close your eyes, take your right index finger, stick it someplace randomly, look at where you stuck your finger, and cook a meal from there. It's fantastic. We did that actually once with Indonesia, and it was unbelievable. I mean, we'd never cooked anything from West Sumatra, and then we cooked a meal. But then what happened to me was completely unplanned. I spent, I think, 2 weeks learning about the maritime empires of Indonesia, about which I was completely ignorant.
That is cool. And on that high note, because we have run out of time, I think it's a very good place to end this conversation, truly with a note of hope, for sure. I just want to express our thanks to Bob Sutton and Huggy Rao, co-authors of The Friction Project, How Smart Leaders Make the Right Things Easier and the Wrong Things Harder. And we encourage you to pick up a copy of The Friction Project here or at your local bookstore, or you can download it to your Kindle. And if you'd like to support the club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit our website at www.commonwealthclub.org. And I'm Mary Cranston. I want to thank you, and I wish all of you a wonderful evening, and take care.
And thank you for interviewing
Thank
us,
you.
Mary. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much, man.
Thank you. Thank you for showing up, too.
Thank you.